Start recording. All right. All right. Welcome, WEB17, pre-processing day one. This is like a web tool that allows us to actually code faster, more efficiently, and better across teams. So pre-processing had its kind of golden age maybe a couple years ago, and now it's become more commonplace. But before pre-processing, man, CSS was pretty awful, just vanilla CSS. You've been living in the pre-processing days so far. So you've been living that painful life. And now we're going to introduce you to the goodness that is pre-processing. So one thing I want to address right from the beginning is we are talking about less. I would say in industry that SAS is used more, just numerically. So why did we choose less? Well, initially is because it lined up perfectly with our stack. We're using React, which also used Yarn for most of its installs because Yarn came from Facebook, React came from Facebook, and less came from JavaScript. So it just lined up perfectly with everything that we were teaching. The good news is, if you know less, you actually know SAS. So if you're nervous about that, if you're like, man, why are we learning SAS? Do not fret one bit. They are one or two symbols different, and conceptually they're identical. So let's talk about what pre-processing is, because this is called pre-processing. It's not called less. So what the heck is pre-processing? Well, we've got this tiny little diagram here. It's talking about syntax. So remember, when I say the word syntax, what do you think? What's going on in your head when I say syntax? Go ahead and give me some responses in channel. Tico says rules. Kevin says grammar. Chance says sugar. So yes, I would say grammar or structure of language is ideal. So when you hear syntax, I want you to think rules and grammar, and specifically how to write code. So in this case, syntax is the first thing that we see. We then are given the opportunity to compile. So the compiler, this is what you guys were installing before class today. And this is what you were using with Yarn. Some of you used NPM, it's fine. But this compiler is actually going to take our syntax and then translate it down to CSS. And that's what we output with pre-processing. So guys, here's the thing. A lot of professionals, full stack developers that kind of poo-poo the front end, they really don't know this process. I've worked with teams internationally and in the United States where we worked on pre-processing projects and the developers only worked on the CSS file. This is a nightmare because every time you run your pre-processing compiler, it deletes this file. So let's talk about how that works. So we've got our code pen link here. I'm going to put in some simple structure. So like div, container, remember it's presentational HTML, so divs are fine. And then we'll just put an H1 in just to keep it super simple. Pre-processing example. So here we are with our example. Remember, every time I hit save, you've got it. I'll move this down. And let's talk about what we do know. We know how to make selections. So here's container, here's an H1, and then we make a color red, for example. Sweet, it works. Everything looks normal here. We also know that we could just do an H1, right? If we wanted to be a general style, that works as well. We also know that we could use the cascade and it still works. But an H1 specifically will only style this H1. For example, if I had another H1, which by the way would not be a good idea because of SEO, notice what happens with that. It's not red. And that's because we specifically highlighted the thing that was in container and H1. This is specificity, right? Specificity 101, a little quick review. So one thing that's really frustrating as a developer is seeing HTML structure and then having to write these kind of awkward selection chains here. Like it's like, man, container H1, it's not as intuitive as if container and H1 were nested. I think it would be more intuitive if we could write it like this. Container, and then nested or put inside, we had an H1 like this. Like that's more intuitive to me. It matches our HTML structure. Well, guess what? We can do that with pre-processing. So this is syntactically correct if we're using a preprocessor. But notice right now, if I change this to like color blue, it's not working, right? And that's because the native browser doesn't understand nested selectors. I hope someday that the standards committee that makes these allows for nesting, but for now, it doesn't allow for it. So in this case, it doesn't work. We need a third party to compile this out to this. So if we go back to this little diagram here, we need the compiler to help the browser know what the heck this means. So let's come back here, and guess what? CodePen has a compiler in it. It's so simple, it's going to make you sad. It's just a drop down, and now you've got a preprocessor. So on your machines, you've had to go through this laborious install. For us in teaching, it's just like, I got to click a button. So don't be sad. Come over here. Let's throw a reset in there as well, just to get things zeroed out for cross-browser. And looky here, we've got our blue. So it worked. Everything worked out properly. So guess what? We can now use this nested structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out just to make sure we understand there's no errors going on. And the coolest thing is we're now using the syntax of less. So over here, we're on this part. We're writing in this section here. So the syntax is, like Chance said, sugar. It allows us to write it in a way that makes more sense to us as humans. But guess what? After the compilation occurs, it's just CSS. So check this out. There's a drop-down arrow inside of this. We can actually see view compiled CSS. So we can actually see the third part. I really like this about CodePen. It's a great teaching tool for doing this. So watch, I'm gonna click this. What? It looks just like the thing that we had before. Because it is, it's just CSS at the end of the day. And so that's like the big aha moment for a lot of new developers is like, oh, preprocessing is just vanilla CSS. It's just that we're writing it in a way that makes sense to us and gives us more tools. And so this is the preprocessing lesson. Like, this is it. Understanding that we write syntax, we have a compiler, and it outputs to CSS. Okay, any questions about this in thread? So in the questions thread, is there any question or confusion about the concept of preprocessing? Excuse me. Okay, I don't see any questions. So what I want you to do, why didn't we learn this first? Because pain always comes before the gain. All right, Lloyd says, did you say it deletes the file every time? I did, Lloyd. Very good observation. So every time you run this compiler on your machine, on your local machine. Now remember, when I say local, what does that mean? Local machine. I just want to make sure we're using the right nerd speak. On my compy, very good. So on your local machine, every time you run this thing, you get a new file. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to add a couple more structures here. So we'll just say like header, nav, A tags, just the classic stuff we always do. Home, and we'll just do the 4 menu items just to give us some more things to play with. And so what I want you guys to do now is I want you to goof around with the nesting that we just made. Just no better way, right? Fingers on keyboard. And I want you to use our nested less. By the way, this is so cool because I hit save on this CodePen, you actually now have everything. So I just love CodePen for preprocessing. It's so good. So in this case, I've given you one example of how to turn something blue. Now I want you to mess around with this structure and with nesting and see what you can do with it. Okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. There's the link. Let me put up the timer. And away you go. We're getting all of you to get into pre-processing. This is exactly what I wanted as part of my master plan. So when you start to see nested selectors, life gets really good. You're just like, man, this is more intuitive. Oh, why is everybody posting CodePens in main channel? You guys are crazy. Let's keep the channel clean so we can get this, so we can get communication in a good spot. During that 5-minute break, I had an epiphany though. I was like, oh my gosh, we piloted portfolios yesterday and I wanted to see some of your work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a thread. Show me your portfolios. I like totally spaced this. Show me. So go ahead into that thread and drop your hosted portfolios. This is something I'm really proud of, that you guys were able to host this on your second week at Lambda School. All right, here we go. That's what I'm talking about. Perfect. Look how pretty that is. Very good. Let's go down to the phone view. Yep, fully responsive. Yes. All right, let's go. Jean. Yes. Guys, I'm telling you, this is going to make a huge impact that you have these so early here. Like, you have no idea. We have people that are 7 months down the road that don't look as good as you. And that's just because you did the template and didn't waste all that time trying to build this thing by yourself. Oh, we have a navigation issue, but this looks awesome. What? Is that a bear? Is that real? Or is that Photoshop? Because if that's real, my mind is blown. See Lawrence. Yes, very good. Look at that. This is perfect. Screenshot. Goes to the GitHub repo. Perfect. Menu. Awesome. Man, this is so good. Jubilee. Perfect. Very good. Good. I love seeing these projects in here. Yes. So, okay, we just saw Kim. I think it was it John that had the same layout? Guess what? It doesn't matter, because you guys are looking for jobs across the world. So you don't have to be worried about somebody else having the same look as you, unless you are literally applying to the same job, which is just astronomically not, like, the numbers are not going to go that way. Unless you're applying to the same job and you work together in a labs group, like we had those 4 students that I talked about yesterday. But even then, they're going to be like, oh yeah, your portfolios look awesome. This is so good. Okay, I'm going to look at a couple more and then we'll move on. I just wanted to see these. See Nick. I love the simplicity here. Did you get this working, Nick? I saw you talking about getting that form working. Awesome. It does work. Very cool. Timothy. Perfect. Gosh, I'm like so proud of you guys. Okay, let's see. Okay, a couple more. I'm just clicking names. Tico. Almost full stack. Get rid of that, dude. You're full stack. You'll get there. Basketball. I love basketball too. Awesome. Cute family. Very cute family. Very cool. Okay. And Megan. Ooh, that's really classy looking. I like that a lot. Megan, this is really pretty. I think this is one of my favorites. That looks really pretty. Very cool. Okay. Man, I am just loving this. So what I want you to do is I want you to continue to add your projects, like every week, add projects to your portfolio, because you now have them hosted on GitHub pages. And you know that when you merge that into master, they just get added, right? Like, you don't have to worry about, you can merge it in now. You don't have to worry about a PM or anything on the assignment. So you should be able just to work off master now at this point, or if you want to keep working off branches. But guys, that was awesome. Thank you for, I forgot I wanted to see those. Okay. I'm like so jazzed about that. All right. So coming back to pre-processing, we've got our preprocessors in place. We now know that there's syntax on the left. We know that there's a compiler in the middle. We know there's outputted CSS at the end. That knowledge is going to help you stay sane as you write your code and you're still getting used to it. So where can we go for documentation? Well, we've got a whole website called lesscss.org. It's in the training kit, but for simplicity, I'll post it here. Oh shoot, I didn't pin the, oh, thank you, Aaron, for pinning that. Pre-processing questions. Let me answer the questions before I move forward though. Okay. Is there any software that turns vanilla CSS into less? Yes, there is. It's a Google away. Francis says, which situation should we use less CSS and which situation should we use CSS? Great question. The answer is, as soon as you've made the decision to use a preprocessor, there is no going back. Like that, you can't, because of the nature of the deletion. So as soon as you as an individual or you as an organization have decided to use a preprocessor, you really can't stop using it. It's an all-in situation. And to me, that's great because you've made a decision. It actually helps your flow and it removes a lot of questions. So hopefully that answers your question. How do you remove the portfolio/website prefix and suffix at the end of the GitHub URL? Ultimately, you'd have to have your own hosting or the portfolio website. It's probably just the name of the repo, Timothy. So just change the name of the repo. Okay. Let's move back into this. So with less, the documentation, notice that we've got this right here. Les is saying, look, if you don't want to fully install the preprocessor, we do have a script tag and a link tag if you're just doing it in browser, but we are not doing that. We're using the true compiler. We need to learn how to use that terminal. We need to embrace the command line interface because it's just part of becoming a programmer, right? Remember, I always talk about becoming a programmer, not a code monkey. And to become a programmer, you've got to embrace everything. And that includes terminal, that includes bash scripting, and that includes using the tools like NPM and Yarn. So we've already done this though, or at least we're in the process of doing this if you watch those videos on Training Kit. So that's the first part. And then we come into the overview. So I want to teach you how to read this documentation. Some of you might have not ever read documentation before. I know that we haven't introduced a common documentation. This is kind of one of those cool new things that I get to introduce you to, where you've got a technology that exists, and then you actually have a place to go look at and reference it. But I know for a new developer, sometimes navigating documentation can be very confusing and intimidating because sometimes you'll read their code and it doesn't work or it doesn't make sense. And that's because sometimes they use pseudocode or fake code to get the explanation across. Also in the navigation system, they've got something here. It says less 3.0 is here. See the changelog. So earlier this, or in 2018 now, wow, less 3.0 came out and it had some really nice features that were added. So we are actually using less 3.0 and above. And currently it's 3.9, so it's moved even faster. So here's what it looks like. There's an overview. See the tab up here where it says overview. And then within the overview, they keep it very simple here. They don't go deep dive. But then they go into learn more about variables. And if you click this link, watch what happens to the navigation system. It jumps to the in-depth guide. I didn't see this when I first started using documentation on this website. And so it's actually not the same thing as the overview anymore. It's the in-depth guide. You're going, well, duh, but I'm saying be careful because the in-depth guide has a ton more information, so much more information than you probably need right now. So I would recommend that you stick an overview for today and try not to go into the in-depth guide as much as you can until you're ready to stretch your legs a little bit. Shut my door. Okay, so we've got variables that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about mix-ins today. We've already just briefly touched on nesting, but really, I've got just one or two more things I want to tell you about nesting. And then we've got nested at rules and bubbling, and this is so cool for media queries. So we're going to be talking about all these things today. We're going to briefly touch on operations inside of CSS. And we'll talk about escaping probably tomorrow. We'll see where we get today. So this kind of represents our game plan. And we're going to deep dive on these topics tomorrow in addition to what we talk about today, as we always do. So I feel like conceptually we understand syntax is written, compiler happens, CSS is produced. So let's look at some more syntax. We'll take probably a look at variables and we'll go to break. So variables, I do not appreciate documentation that says that. They are pretty self-explanatory. I mean, come on. I know that, but you should at least give me some insight documentation. So I was a little bothered when I saw that, but whatever. So in this case, you'll notice that there's an @ symbol. So what? That's crazy. An at symbol in CSS? Well, remember, we're not in CSS anymore. We're in less. So if we were to take this exact code over here, well, we'll just bring it over here and we'll change it something. I'll say, you know, at color or something. Custom color. So with custom color, we're going to change it to blue like we had before. Notice something. I haven't actually used the color. Actually, let me change it to something else since blue's already there. Let's just do orange. I'm going to make my font size a little bit bigger so we can see this thing since we did our reset. I know I'm using PX. Don't be mad. We're just showcasing things, but I'm glad you're mad. So at custom color, we have orange, and then you'll notice that we've got this color, right? Well, how do we use the variable? Well, it's as simple as referencing the variable. So what we do is we copy and paste this in, and looky here, it goes orange. Oh, baby, we've got variables. So now we can think about all the use cases of a variable. So you might be going one-to-one, like, this is stupid, Josh. Why would you ever do this? Like, it's actually worse than dry. And you're like, I'm like, good job, you're right. But the second that you need to use that variable again, now it becomes really powerful. So I usually use variables the second time that I need them. It's a good rule of thumb. If you only need it one time, don't worry about it. Oftentimes, companies will come in hand with a design document and say, okay, here's our 16 hex codes that we always use. Never break this pattern. Well, guess what? That's a great thing to put in variables, right? Because then you'll never be wrong. You'll always have your 16 variables. So for example, I've often seen something like this where it'll be like main BG or something. So that's the main background. And then what they'll do is instead of saying like red, they'll abstract the color, they meaning the developer, and they'll abstract it to a colored name. So they'll come in here and they'll say like company red. And they know that that's from the company red swatch file. And the hex code, of course, well, we'll just use red for now just to keep things super simple. So instead of having company red, they'll actually use the variable within a variable right there. So then what they can do is they can come over here and say, all right, background at main BG. And notice what happened here. We've abstracted the color away and we changed it with meaning. So now my background color is abstracted away to main BG. This is extremely valuable on a team because what can happen is big boss comes in and says, we're still going to keep company red for some things, but now we've got a company blue color that needs to be introduced. And our marketing team says that blue is going to convert more. And then you're going, shoot, okay. Well, the cool thing is if you've got main BG set up, all you've got to do is swap out the one abstraction and now it's blue. That's freaking cool. So these abstractions happen with variables all the time in JavaScript and other languages, and we're just getting a little taste of it here. But look at that. I'm using a variable to reference a variable. That's awesome. So now I can abstract some of these things away. Now, I'm showing you examples that don't really apply to 1H1, but multiply this by, as you now know from yesterday's project, 8,000 lines of CSS. This can help a lot because you know exactly where everything is and everything's really organized. Okay, so let's talk about what happens to variables when they're compiled. So everybody, I'm gonna hit save. Everybody, I want you to hit this drop down with me, and I want you to hit view compiled CSS. Everybody do this with me. If you forgot my CodePen link among the crazy links, here's the original. Okay, everybody go ahead, hit view compiled CSS with me. Click. There it is. What happened to the variables? They went away. Did they? Well, they were actually consumed by the compiler. So the compiler said, okay, here's everything. You only need orange and you only need blue, and that's all you need. So this is the beauty of a preprocessor. The preprocessor, we write extra code for us to reuse over and over, but at the end of the day, at the end of the processing day, it's just CSS, everybody. It's all it is. So I want you guys to get in the mindset that when it's compiled, it's just vanilla CSS. There's nothing special about the CSS. What's special is the syntax. Okay? So if we go back to view uncompiled, You can see all of our variables are still here. So guess what? Variables are what's called lazy loaded. Because the compiler can take its sweet little time and it's not a runtime thing. So when I say runtime, what does that mean to you? When I say it's not a runtime thing, what goes through your head? Real time, middle of the programming. Yes, very good. When someone is viewing the site right now, very good. So pre-processing is not a runtime experience. And because of that, which is great, by the way, we can, as a developer, we can do a lot of crazy different things that we don't have to worry about for a runtime. Like JavaScript will runtime execute things, but pre-processing does it while we're not showing the end result. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because the way the program's written. So in this case, at company red and blue, guess what? I could put these at the bottom of the page and everything would work. You see that? So everything works perfectly here. So all this stuff is working because at runtime, it doesn't matter. So this concept is called lazy loaded variables. That means if I put variables anywhere, they're in a valid position. So let's see, what if I put them inside of container here? Does that work? No, we got an error. Company blue is undefined. So it still needs to be available to the full scope of the app and the CSS that I'm writing. So that's a new word to us, at least in our guided demos. So when I say scope, what do you think? Matt says reach. I like reach. Anybody else? I see several people. Visibility, what can see it? Ooh, I like that. Parent-child relationships. Block versus local. Ooh, that's a JavaScript term right there, Lloyd. Code block, accessible, current, where in the nest. Awesome. So in this case, I want you to think about scope as, like you were saying, the reach or visibility across the app. So these blocks of code, these curly braces right here, are protecting the scope of everything inside of it from being seen. But if they're available out here, outside of the curly brace, everything inside of these curly braces actually has visibility to these pieces. Isn't that cool? That's why I like teaching pre-processing first before JavaScript, because you have an opportunity to be introduced to some of these concepts sooner. Okay, I think this is a great time for our synapses to take a little break, build some plasticity. So let's take a 5-minute breather. When we come back, we'll just keep delving further into the pre-processing. 5 minutes. Take a break. Step away from the computer. Variables can be used before it's declared. Yes, because of the lazy loading and if the scoping is correct, Xander. And then Nick said yes, based in the docs. Cool. So thanks for helping each other out as peers. I think sometimes as a fellow student, you might think, well, I'm asking Josh. Well, guys, I don't know everything. Like, I know a lot, but make sure that you don't discount your peers. All of you are coming back from amazing backgrounds like I've never had experience in. We can all learn from each other. So I always learn from you, learn from me, and don't assume that your peers don't know anything. Timothy says, is it best practice to put your preprocessor variables at the top? Okay, so let's talk about that. There is actually a best practice here, beyond the big boss response, and that is exactly what you said, Timothy. So often what people will do, developers, I'm going to go ahead and delete this since we don't need it. Also, I want to show you how cool comments are. So check it out. They're JavaScript comments. So we don't have to do that stupid /* crap anymore. It's just 2 slashes, and it's so nice. So what we can do is this will be variables, and you're basically just telling the next developer, hey, look, these are where I'm housing my variables. And you're basically just making a contract and saying, I'm going to put them all here because they are lazy loaded. It's great of you for the next developer to let them know where they need to be. So that would be best practice, is to house your variables in the same area. Just so you know, because white spacing doesn't matter, you'll often get variables that have developers that have OCD, and they love to do this. You'll see this all the time because they just like it. So some people don't like it. other people do, but you'll see that quite a bit in industry. Okay, let's move forward. So looking at the documentation, we've discussed variables, and they are as simple as they look. They are pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot more to it. So if you want to learn even more, click that button later in the in-depth guide, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It references the lazy loading stuff that I referenced. Okay, mixins. This is really, really cool stuff. So mixins allow us to use and reuse CSS classes over and over, more, and even mix them together. So check this out. There might be a class called bordered, and it's got a border top, dotted 1px, and a bordered bottom. So this happens quite a bit. You've got a design pattern that your designer is using over and over on many pages. And maybe they're doing this exact thing, a top dotted and a bottom solid. Well, it's so annoying to write this out every time. It's not very dry. So what do? Well, we can actually mix it in right into the selector. So let's go ahead and try it out. I'm going to get rid of these just awesome colors. Well, I don't want to, if I do that, it's going to throw errors. Actually, this will be really cool. Watch what happens when I delete this. Error. So this is something interesting that I wanted to address early on in your pre-processing life. In CSS, if you make a mistake, oftentimes the browser will just strong arm it and they know what you meant. And so sometimes you can write really malformed CSS that still works because browsers are smarter than you. But preprocessors, they are going to yell at you if you move anything in the wrong spot. And I actually appreciate this because preprocessors let you know early that you goofed. But here's the problem with that. It looks like everything's still working, but it stopped compiling. So now if I come over here and I want to change that orange to white, notice that it doesn't go white. And so sometimes as a new developer, you're not watching your console. So that terminal, whatever you're using for the command line interface, keep that in a visible place while you're developing. Because if you don't, and then an error throws up, you're not going to see the error, and everything's going to keep working. So notice that I've got an error here. I'm going to click it, and it says warning, variable company blue is undefined. So that means I tried to use a variable that has not been defined. So I got to get rid of company blue, or I have to make sure that it does have a definition. Make sense? So these errors will occur all the time. Like if you're missing a semicolon, or if you're missing a semicolon or a bottom bracer or something, it's going to yell at you. And I love that about preprocessors. They keep you really honest with your code. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to say gray because it's just not hurting my eyes anymore. So then let's go look at what mixins can do. So remember we had that mixin, the bordered mixin. By the way, mixins are also lazy loaded, just like variables. And so the thing is, and I'm going to put a little comment here, they also go at the top of the page just out of convenience. And I usually put them out of convenience under variables. So usually a file that I'm writing looks like this. It'll say variables, mixins. And then I'll have another comment that's like general styles. So in this case, with bordered, I'm applying a border top that's dotted, and then I've got a border bottom that's solid. And so let's go ahead and introduce a section tag down here. Section. And let's just say that all section tags have the same kind of thing. So we'll just keep going down. Less is more. I'm going to do a p tag, lorem ipsum. Okay. So here's our chunk of code. Now, right now, let's get some constraints. Like, make this look at least halfway decent. So we've got a max width. Let's do a margin 0 auto like we always do. Okay, cool. We're starting to look more like a web page. Let's get some default padding in there so we don't have to worry about the gutters looking so gross. We'll just do 20. Oh, we got to use our box sizing. So what I'll do is I'll put our general styles here now. So box sizing border box, just so we don't have to worry about that padding issue. And there we go. So already we're just looking that much better. And of course, our H1, H2, H3, let's go ahead and just put some margin around them. Top and bottom is probably where we want it most. So let's just do like 15. And then left and right, we won't goof with it. So we get some spacing. So now we've got our own custom styles all set up nicely with just a couple lines of code. This looks just so much better. Okay, so now we've got our container, we've got our H1, and let's say that we wanted to have that border around this section tag. Also, what we could do is we could say, introduce some padding top and bottom just to give it some breathability when the border's in there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I've got the section tag, and I could keep it like naked, no class, no ID, just a normal section tag, or I could give it a class. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a class just to keep it more specific. I'm going to say main content. So here's main content. Let me make sure that I'm keeping it nested inside of container. Now this is where things get interesting though. With nesting, if we nest too deep, if we keep going down this rabbit hole, so for example, if I come in here and I say main content, and then I've got an H2, like I'm starting to get pretty nested here. Like we're at least 4 levels deep or 3 levels deep here. And so the general rule of thumb, and this is like professional general rule of thumb, is try to avoid going more than 4 deep, because that means your selector is like nasty looking. So for example, if I came in here and I had a span just to showcase this, is more. Well, then it looks like this, right? So then if we put some code in here, we said, okay, color blue, you can see less is more there. We'll do red so you can see it. And then we have an H2, and let's say that the H2 had a font size of 30 px. Now let's go, and then we had main content had some style on it. And we just said line height 1.25, for example. Okay, so now let's see what the compiled CS looks like. View compiled. So now you can see, look at these crazy selectors we just built. I mean, that is really specific, right? So in this case, this is something that we have to be aware of when other developers are trying to read our code. And ultimately, the browser does take time to traverse all of those tree structures that we built. So please, caution, don't go more than 4 deep, because right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so how do you avoid going 4 deep if you literally have HTML structures that are beyond 4 deep? Well, the answer to that is that you just cut off one of the ones on the left. So for example, if we came back down here and I said, you know what, container is a really general style. Like I actually shouldn't be nesting anything in container. So I could actually abstract all these out. So my H1 down like that. So container could just be its general style. And then I just reintroduce this here, right? Also notice that H1, by the way, I like to have my super general styles above my container. Like that's just me, I like to have a separation. So if we come over here, main content starts to get into like our page styles. And now let's go see view compiled source. Get out of here. That is much more obtainable, and we just cut out, another level of nesting. So it's a simple trick, but if you find yourself going more than 4, start looking at your structure and rethinking of how far you're going in your selector chains, because the specificity is so great. This might as well be an ID, right? Like it's not reusable. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're writing code. It's like, oh, I've gone more than 4. I need to start looking at solutions to shallow this out. Otherwise, IDs. Okay. Any questions about what I've just talked about regarding the nesting? Oh, I haven't talked about the actual mixin. Sorry, let's do that thing. I got a little lost in that nesting awesomeness. So now we've got our main content, and let's say we wanted to add that border and the padding here. So watch this. It's as simple as typing the name of the class. So notice what happened here. We probably need some margin too. Do 10px 0, and then we'll do 10px 0 here. And yes, you could put this in a variable if you wanted. So you can see that we've got this bordered experience we could reuse over and over if we wanted to. So let's say we had another section tag for the same class. Of course, it's just CSS, right? So copy and paste, it's all there. So this is really, really helpful to reuse code that you know you're going to use over and over and over again. See how it says bordered? So let's go see what it looks like when it's compiled. Notice that the bordered mixin is now basically a general style. It's a general class. And then we come down to main content and look, there's the bordered stuff we put in there. So when it gets consumed by the compiler and resolved, that's what happens. But here's the thing. This is not a good behavior. You don't want to see your mixin up here because it's an actual class. It could actually ruin something. So we have some syntactical sugar to get rid of it. Here's how it works. If you're using a mixin, my recommendation is to always use parentheses like this, because that signifies to the compiler that it also needs to be resolved and not used as a standalone class. That's all that means. So let's see what happens when we view compiled. I'm going to hit save. Here we go. And look what happened. It's no longer there, but the code got there. So it became like a variable in the way that it got consumed by the compiler. So let's review that one more time. When you write a mixin, it looks just like a class, except for the fact that we can reuse it and nest it in other classes. In addition to that, we can use parentheses to basically have the compiler consume it so it doesn't get reused as a class later on accident on the global scale. Pretty cool. So guess what? We can actually mix other things into other things and then mix those things into other things. So we can actually do this. We could say, another mixin. I use my parentheses because I want it to be consumed. Now, some of you JavaScripters are probably itching and going, I want to pass some arguments in there. And guess what? You can, but we'll get there shortly. So we have another mixin, and guess what? We can actually put in bordered here. We're referencing bordered here. We can use it, by the way, we can reference it like that, or we can do this. They're both valid. If you're not actually passing any arguments, though, you don't need to have the parentheses on the use. And then you could actually introduce another mixin. So we could come over here and just say, example, color blue. And then we could actually mix this in. That's why they call it a mixin. And then we can use this guy all the way down here. So we could come down here and say, well, instead of bordered, I want my whole crazy another mixin. And then now everything goes blue. You see that? That's crazy. That's awesome. It's literally your imagination is the limit. And of course, working with a team and trying to figure out things that make sense. So let's go review that one more time. Up here, we have bordered, which is just a border mixin with some box model. We've got an example mixin just to showcase that we can move things together. I've got another mixin, which is just another example. And then over here, we've got bordered that came from here. We've got example that came from there. And then we can use these together in the new one. All right, so those of you that are very practical, you're probably going, I don't see the practical use case for this, even though it is cool. Good job. You're not wrong. I think sometimes when people see pre-processing and they see all these really cool tricks and tips, they kind of get lost in like trying to make things just amazingly complex. And I would caution you against this. I would say, make sure that you only use mixins when you need them. I'll like a huge project, I'll probably just have like 3 or 4 mixins. And usually it's just display flex and justify content center, align center. So my favorite mixin of all time that I've written is this. Center. and then I say display flex, and justify content, and align items. That's my favorite mix-in right there. And I use that quite a bit because you always need to center crap. Now here's the thing. Here's the thing. And this is really cool thing. Center is cool, but what if you had the power to control these values? So you can make a mix-in like this. So instead of just being limited to center, what if you knew what you always wanted? Well, the cool thing is you can pass those in as variables. So if you recall, we could say at, which is just a variable. We could say justify, right? Comma, because it's an argument, at align. And then I could take all this information. I can actually pass the values in as arguments that are going to hold our the parameters that are going to hold our arguments. So display flex is the constant, but now I can tell whatever I want it to do. So I could actually pass in these values. So how would you call this? Well, it would look like this: custom layout, and then you could say center center. And that's how you could call custom layout. Now that is pretty sick, instead of having to write justify content, display flex, and align items every time. Like, that's super, super cool. So then you can come over here, and let's say we wanted to try this out. Let's center our main content, for example. So what we could do is I could pop that custom thing in and check it out. It'll center everything. Now it looks gross because, but remember, so justify is our first value. So we could say space between, and then, well, we just don't have enough. We don't have enough space to breathe right now, so there's no space between. Yeah, it's kind of a silly example because everything's jammed together. But center gets the job done. If I had, I could do it on my navigation system actually. So let me go grab this and do it on the nav. So let's go over here. So we've got our pre-processing example and our header, right? So our container could actually use this, and I'm going to drop the font size down to 30 so we have some space to move around. And so let's get it so it says pre-processing on the left and navigation on the right. So all I got to do is drop this mix-in in. My justified content is going to be what? It's going to be space between. And my centering, let's see, do I have that right? Justify and align, justify and align. Yep, I do. Display flex on my layout. It's going to have my H1. Oh, wait, shoot, I have more pieces in my container. Shoot, okay. So what I could probably do is introduce another div here. Oh, no, usually I have my H1 in my header. That's why I'm goofing. I was just goofing around there. My bad. That's why HTML structure is so important. Like, honestly, you've got to be aware of your HTML structure. So over here, I have header, and now I'm going to put my custom layout inside of here. And there's the desired result we wanted. You can see if we compile this code, what happens? Well, first off, all of our mix-ins just got eaten up by the compiler. They got resolved, consumed. And then we come down to our header, and guess what? There it is. So I didn't have to write these 3 lines of code. Now, yes, there was an upfront cost as a developer of writing this code, of just like writing it, right? But the cool thing is, usually whenever I start a new project, I've got my 3 or 4 mix-ins. So I'll use like borders, border radius, and stuff like that. Also, there's cross-browser compatibilities. So when you work on Firefox and Chrome and Safari, they have different web rendering engines that we've talked about, and they have different actually web prefixes. So what's a web prefix? It's basically a way for you to tell what's supposed to happen on each individual browser. So these prefixes are for older browsers. Newer browsers are actually really good now. But sometimes you're forced to code for a demographic or a financial institution that does not allow for different web browsers to upgrade on their machines. And so to do that, I'm not kidding, it sucks, but that's life. So inside of here, you have to go to these CSS prefixes to make sure that everything works across every browser. And so each vendor, meaning the browser's company, like Firefox, Apple, so Mozilla, Apple, Google, they have these prefixes to make sure that if you write this line of code, that it'll for sure work. Isn't that so freaking annoying? I hate it. I hate that we even have these. But the cool thing is, so we can look up like less web prefixes. Let's see. And so you can see here, for example, like box shadow. Box shadow won't work across every browser unless you have the prefixes correctly in the older browsers. Well, so what you can do is you can have this box shadow written 3 times for you, given all the prefixes. So that's how it works. Pretty crazy. So you can see here all these crazy different things. I think I have something in the training kit that talks about all the prefixes. Let's go see. Where is it? Crap, I don't see it. I think it's the CSS tricks last prefixes. Just so you don't have to think about it. Maybe it's this one. Dang it, I don't want to waste time with this, but, oh, there it is. Useful CSS3 mixins. Here, I'll give you this link. So to combat these older browsers, by the way, this is really niche to companies that do this, but you still have to do it. But see all these prefixes? Well, don't you want to just stop using CSS when you see these? Like when I first found out about these, I was so disappointed. I was like, are you kidding me? Like I have to write like this? And before preprocessors, yes, like you had to write every one of these lines to make sure that it looked good on every browser. But now what we can do is we can write it one time. So for example, box shadow, we can write it one time, and if we pass in the value, it'll output. So look at something like box sizing, for example. Let's go look at that. So we'll come over here, look at our code. So right now, my box sizing code, this is actually not cross-browser compatible with older browsers. So box sizing actually won't be enabled on some older browsers. So what do? You pop in a mixin instead. Well, I'll keep it up here in the mixins. And then what you do is instead of calling it directly, you say box sizing, because that's the name of our mixin, right? And that's all you got to do is just reference it. Again, so let's go see what happens when it's compiled. You can see I've got my WebKit, my Moz, and my box sizing now, so it'll work across all those browsers. It's one of the saddest things I ever have to teach you, is that these browsers don't like each other, or at least they didn't for a long time. The newer browsers are much more standard-based, so they're all following the same thing. But this is a real thing that you will deal with in your career. And if you don't know about it now, I did you a disservice. So there you go. This is the most practical use, I think, of mixins, followed by the fun layout stuff that I showed you. Okay, let me see what we have in thread. Okay, Dan says, since less variables of scope, does that mean we can override global variables by nesting local versions inside of element blocks? You could, but it would just be bad practice. Like there's just no reason for that. It would be an accident more than on purpose. Skylar says, wouldn't BEM help with this problem of going down the rabbit hole? So you're referencing block element modifier design pattern. So BEM, by the way, Skylar, is a design pattern. It's not a preprocessor. And often BEM and preprocessors are at odds with each other because BEM is a naming convention, whereas preprocessors are compilers. So usually if you're using BEM, you're not using a preprocessor. Just depends on where you work though. Megan says, why does the red is more look all awkward and pixelated? I think it's just the colors fighting each other, like the gray and the red just looks gross. It does look gross. You're right. Good eye. Color conflict. Yeah, I'd say maybe they're not web safe next to each other. How does less differentiate between a media tag and a variable? Great question, Jordan. So the @media tag is a special reserved word inside of preprocessing syntax rules. That's how. It's stupid, but that's how. Lloyd says, does it help to think of mixins as similar to JS methods? I think of mixins as mixins in CSS, but you could think of them as functions, and not methods are functions that are nested inside of an object literal. So that's why I don't want to go down that path, Lloyd. I would just say function. Jordan says, if mixins combine two classes with the same property, for example, color, which property will be chosen by less? The lowest one on the cascade. So it's still CSS at the end of the day. Sam says, regarding avoiding more than 4 levels deep of nesting, does CSS syntax matter anymore if you're using a preprocessor? Do you or other developers look at your CSS, or they look at your less code? Great question. The answer is never look at the CSS anymore. Always look at the Sass or the less or whatever you're using. That's how you tell. Now, there are map files. It's a little more advanced, but there are ways to build a map file when you compile. And if you right-click and inspect your code in the browser, it'll actually tell you where it came from in the less file. It's pretty cool. So Google that if you're interested. Okay. Awesome. So what I need you guys to do now is to play around with this and get some experience, fingers on keyboard. So it's time to take what I've given you and push it further. So go make your own mixins, add your own HTML. Let's see what you can do in the next 5 minutes. So go play around with mixins. Go see what you can do with like passing in variables. Try to pass in variables, try to see what that feels like so we can ask any questions that came from it. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to put up the timer, and I want you to build your own mixin or just experiment with what I've already given you. Okay. 5 minutes. Timer is running now. Let me bring it back to our screen here. All right, I would like to see some of the things that you worked on and just kind of see where your mind is at. So will someone, here, I'll open up a method. Or what the heck, I said method because I read the chat. So thread for your pre-processing trials. Okay, pop in some CodePen links here. I want to review some of the stuff you looked at. Okay, Gil, let's see what you worked on here. Nice, I can see changes here. So I can see some margin, awesome. Notice that there's multiple values, so that's actually valid. You can have multiple values, not just one. Bordered through in the margin, perfect. Good, I'm seeing that. Colorize, I like that, very cool. Awesome. And the implementation of it there. Perfect. Colorize white and blue. Very good. You get it. Very good. Okay, let's see. Timothy. Tim's lazy typing mixins. Nice. Come in here. Main. Yep. Got all the variables working. Uh-oh. No. We can't be having an important in there. That's a no-no. So get rid of that. 20px, font size, its size. Very cool. So FS. So by the way, this is a little confusing. What does FS mean? So be careful on naming things so short for the next developer. P10 makes actually some sense because it's padding, but FS would be a little hard to understand. Display, very cool. Yep. Awesome. Good job, Timothy. I can see your thinking patterns there. Julian, see what you got. Whoa. Okay. We've got a gradient going on here. But you know what? Mixins are perfect for gradients. Yeah. Awesome. So we've got a horizontal gradient. He's got his start color, end color, and then he can reuse it over and over. So if we look at the compiled source code, you can now see how much code didn't have to be written. That's awesome. Very good use of a mix in there. I would say gradients, if you do use them. By the way, gradients are very out of style right now, but if you do use them lightly, and they can be awesome. Cool. Okay, and then Dylan, your last one. Cool. We got 4 people. Let's see what we got here. Nice. I like the rems over here. Very good. Border, flex. So I would recommend to not name custom mixins after similar properties of other CSS properties. So you always want to make sure that you're letting the next developer know that it's custom. So that's why I said custom layout. You could say custom flex. You just don't want to accidentally override a default style because you got lazy in your naming convention. So because that could be very misconstrued there. So just a little side warning there, but I think that looks great. Very good. Okay. Thank you for putting yourselves out there. I mean, I'm critiquing your code, but also praising you. I know it's not easy, so thank you for putting yourself out there. I think that's awesome. Okay. All right, let's see. It's 11:22 or 10:22. Let's see where we want to go next. I think we're going to talk about nested mixins. That'd be the best thing. How are our brains doing? Do we want to break or do we want to keep going? How are we feeling? Let me, sorry, don't answer that. Break, and then I just want you to say yes, no to that. So yes or no. Go ahead, yes or no real quick on that. Oh man, we are the most 50. Oh no, there, yes is winning. One maybe. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll finish up the rest of we're gonna move into nesting, nested at roles. So it actually is a great time to take a break. All right, 5-minute break. Here we go. Let's finish strong here. We'll cover 2 new topics and review everything and then send you off to your assignment. Well, to lunch, of course. All right, let me go to my browser. Let's see here. It's going to have the last thing. There it is. Nope, doesn't look like it moved. Come on now, Zoom. Please work. Thank you. Okay. So let's just do a quick rehashing of everything. So we've got, let's go to the training kit and just remember what we started with. Syntax, the less, it looks like CSS, but it's ever so slightly different with a couple of new symbols and meanings. So that's the syntax, or the ways we write the code. The compiler, you guys know about this because before class started, you had to install this, or I have been installing it. And then CSS, you're more familiar with, of course. We've been working with it this whole time. So now that we've kind of been messing around with pre-processing, let's review this one more time. We write our code in a certain way. Now here's the thing, on your computers, when you're doing this and you don't have CodePen automatically, every time I write a new line, does a compilation. You just can't see it. On your computer, you will be able to see it. You will be able to see your command line interface refresh every time you write something and every time you hit save. So the reason I had you install less watch compiler, by the way, is so you didn't have to run the compiler every time. So you're welcome, because if you didn't do that, you would have to run that less command, less C, every time. You'd have to go in your terminal and run it every time you hit save. So the less watch compiler allows you to automatically run the compiler when you hit the save button on your computer. So that's why there's those 2 things. That's the compiler portion. And then the CSS is just the CSS that's outputted that the browser actually reads. So pop quiz, do you ever edit the CSS after you use a preprocessor? Not at all. Very good. Why is that though? Why don't you ever touch the CSS? Perfect. Gil says it really good. It gets recreated. Les overwrites it. That's right. It just gets overwritten. Very, very good. Okay. You guys are getting it. You're doing it, Peter. Okay. So if we come back over here, We've got our pre-processing example. We've got 2 more concepts to cover. The biggest one that I'm really excited about is these nested at rules and bubbling. So nested at rules sounds a little weird because it just does sound weird. But when you look at it, it's not so weird. So the at rules are saying at media. And there's also this funny one called at supports, which we're just going to gloss over. You can Google it if you want, but it's kind of a fun tag for different browser support. But I'm not going to lose sleep over it, neither should you. Look at the at media tag. That's the big winner here. So see what they're doing here? They're nesting the media tag in the selector. Oh, okay. Let's go see how this works. So I'll just grab one of their selectors, throw it in here. And we learned about responsiveness last 2 days. So now we're going to incorporate our responsiveness into our own code. So if we come in here, go into our container, and now we've got a media tag. Now I'm going to go ahead and just swap this out to something that makes more sense. I don't know why they use the most stupid examples on that. So we'll say 500. That makes sense. Easy to read. And we don't have a background image. So let's say that once we get down to that level, we change our background to white. Isn't this crazy? Like, look how clean this is. And this is probably why I was making so many typos when I was showing you media queries, because I'm so used, like, by the way, I don't write normal CSS ever anymore in my life. Any project, even if it's a 1-page website, I'm using a preprocessor because it's so much faster to write. So in this case, I've now got my media query nested inside of my container. And now watch what happens. If I get down below 500, boom, it goes white. I forgot our title's white. So what do we got to do? We got to go to our at media. Oops. Come in here. And we got to go black with our media query on the H1. Not the background, but the color. So you see how nice that is? Like, you can put a media query in wherever you need it, and you don't have to have that big nasty media query at the bottom of the page. But more than this, you don't have to rewrite your selector, because what happens is the preprocessor bubbles out. So let me get my annotation tool here and show you what I mean by bubbling. So this media query here will actually bubble out on the compiler and actually wrap around this. The compiler does it, so you don't have to worry about it. You just need to know that it is happening. So what does that mean? Well, let's go look at the compiled source. And now you can see this looks very familiar, right? So it goes from the inside, bubbles out, and wraps it, allowing us to write our code more intuitively, but allowing the browser to understand the CSS. That is why less is more, right? This is so nice for us to have to write like this. So tomorrow I'm going to show you some really cool tips and tricks with CSS. We're just going to keep going pre-processing, where we can make this even more elegant for us. But for now, I just want you to be aware that this is how you use media queries inside of, down here, inside of our preprocessor. It's that simple. You just put a media query inside of the selector. And this is just so organized, because let's say you had one at your tablet view and then you had one at your phone view, right? So all you got to do is it's still CSS, like the cascade still applies. So I could just come in here and I could say, okay, at 700, we'll say it's our tablet, and then at 500 is our phone, or 400. So we can come in here and we could say, orange. So at 700, we're black, up above it, we're white, and then we get down to orange when we're on phone. Isn't that amazing? That's freaking amazing. Why is it amazing? Because you can see every device for that one selector. So you never have to guess on a different part of the page where the H1 is going to change. You always know at all times what it's going to look like and function like in your app. Like, there's no guessing. It's all in front of you. It's all literally in front of you. And it's super elegant. We're going to make this, again, even better tomorrow. It's going to look just slightly bit, because you're probably just going, man, I want to put that in a variable. And so we can put some of it in a variable. That'll be tomorrow. Okay. that is nested at rules. Any questions about nested at rules? Let me go to the thread. And someone linked me the thread. It looks like I lost it in the break. Someone put the questions thread in channel real quick. Just a link to the thread. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Noah says, apologies if I missed this. Don't apologize. We're here to learn. Like, don't worry. Is there a difference between appending the parentheses and mix-ins versus when you're implementing it? So Noah, great question. When we come down here, notice that I'm using parentheses because I'm passing arguments, right? I'm passing these values, which we call arguments, into the parameters. If Noah, I didn't need to, then I don't need the parentheses. So for example, if I always, like for my center, remember my center mix-in, it's not consuming an argument. So Noah, the answer would be, all I have to do is type center, right? Just like that. Well, I have to use the dot, right, to signify it's a mix-in, and that's it. No parentheses are required. So hopefully that helps. If it has arguments, yes, parentheses are required. If it doesn't, no parentheses are not required. But when you're defining the mix-in, I always recommend you use parentheses so it gets consumed and doesn't become a general style on accident. Good question. Should you turn no, did you just delete that? You're crazy. All right, so Steven says, let's see. What's going on? I feel like the questions channel just got wrecked. Should you turn off autosave and VCS while using less on VS Code? I don't know. If it's auto-saving like every keystroke, yes, turn it off. If it's auto-saving like in increments, I don't know. Auto-saving, I would never, I don't know. I would take it off if I'm using a preprocessor because you're just going to get error codes all the time. That's a tricky one, Steven. That's up to you, man. Lloyd says, in what ways are less and SAS the same? Okay, so that's a great question. SAS, the only difference between SAS and less is the variable syntax. So the @ symbol is a $sign. That's it. That's the only difference between SAS and less on a variable level. So that's a SAS variable right there. For mix-ins, the only difference, they function the same, but instead of saying bordered, you would say @mixin bordered. And that's the only difference right there. So that would be SAS syntax. And then SAS implementation is you say, instead of bordered or custom layout like that, you would say @include custom layout, and then you'd pass your variables. That's it. That's the only differences as far as syntax goes. So that's why I say if you've learned less, you know SAS. It's just like 10 minutes of studying the syntax, getting used to it. Now, that's SCSS, by the way. Since you asked, I think a lot of you are probably interested. SAS proper, SASS proper, is an indentation-based syntax. So, for example, like with this nested structure, do you see this looks exactly like less because it is the same concept. And that's SCSS. SAS, ASS, SASS uses indentation. So watch this. Click. Ooh, that looks pretty, right? So some people really like the indentation approach, but I'm telling you, 9 times out of 10, when a shop, like a web shop or an agency or company says they use SAS, they're using SCSS because developers love their brackets and they love their semicolons. It's the 1 out of 10 that actually uses the indentation based. So don't be scared. It's just indentation. It's pretty fun. But again, I'm not concerned. Like the 2 or 3 things I just showed you are the only things that are different. So there's your mix-ins, right? So there's your mix-in, and then there's your @include, just like I showed you. And that's it. That's the only difference. Okay. Will less respect the order of your nested at medias? Yes, it will. Noah, don't apologize for the apology. Lawrence says, can you give an example of when you would need to nest media inside of another media query? I would never nest a media query in a media query. I would just nest them like I showed you here. Like I would not put a media query in here. That'd be silly. I would just put another one below it. So good question. Mattel says, can you explain this again? Custom layout? Yes, I can totally explain that again. So over here, this is what we call a parametric mixin. It has a special name because it has parameters. Okay. Because, and the parameters are these little people right here, these little symbols. So parameters are placeholders. I could name them anything I want. We're going to talk way more about this in JavaScript. But in pre-processing, you just need to know that these are placeholders that are waiting for a value to be popped into them. I wanted to call them something that made sense, but you can call them whatever the heck. I could call this banana, and I could call this apple. As long as I'm consistent, everything will work. So don't get caught up in the naming conventions of parameters. They're just placeholders for information. Because if you recall, the way you call this is custom layout. And then what do? You pass in the arguments. So that's the big difference between arguments and parameters. Arguments are the values being passed into the parameter. So then we come in here and we say center and center, for example. So I'm going to comment this out so we can keep it close. And sometimes, by the way, I'll put the comment of how to use it above the mixin for the next developer, just in case they're in a hurry and they don't want to read through it. So I'll often do this. I'll say, this is how you use it. So in this case, this would still work. And you can see it is working, right? Like all this stuff still works, even with banana and apple. But again, you want to make the next developer be aware of what you're trying to do. So justify makes sense because you're going to say justify content's value. And align makes sense because it's going to be align's value. So that's why I did that. Hopefully that helps Itel to go through that again. And if I'm wrecking your name, please tell me, is it Itel or is it Itel? I or I? Because you ask a lot of good questions and I just feel bad every time. Okay, James says, he said we don't edit the CSS file anymore. Where are we doing the pre-processing? I'm a bit confused on that. So James, you can see right here it says less, right? And then the compiler is on the server. So that is confusing for CodePen, no doubt. On CodePen, on their server, on this web server here, they're actually running under the hood the compiler that you are running in your terminal command. So great question, James. And that's why we have this compiled drop down. So you can see how it says compiled up here now versus uncompiled, which is less. So the magic is CodePen server is actually compiling every time I write something new. So great question, James. The answer resides in your terminal. That's where the compilation occurs. Does that make sense? Okay. Gil says, is there a way to put in default params in a parametric mixin? Yes, there are. So you can just simply define them, just like I think we did that with border. Yeah. So this is a predefined mixin or parameter in the parametric mixin. So unless you'd say something else, this is always going to be the default value. So that's how you do it, Gil. Okay. Those are all the questions I saw. Let's talk about, I'm still waiting for Itel or Itel to respond. I want to know how to say your name. Okay, if we come back over here, we've got operations. Oh, here we go. I tell you. Okay. All right, I tell. There we go. I got it. Thank you. So in this case, we have operations. This is the last thing we'll talk about. So operations are literally plus, minus, multiplication, and division. Like it's that simple. What's not so simple, and which I'll explain right now, is that it only respects the first unit in a given operation. So for example, they have CM. Of course, they don't use normal units here. So frustrating. But in this case, they will take the thing that is the most left unit that's been introduced. So you have to be very careful that you don't try to do this kind of stuff. Keep it very simple. So you want to do like 2 plus 2. Well, let's go look at this really quick. So let's find the font size here. So if I say plus 10, what's happening here is it's taking this unit right there, px, and applying it to the whole equation. What if I said 10 rem? It does not matter. It will totally disregard the second unit. So be careful. That's the one got you with operators in a preprocessor. So they're cool if you want to like do a certain math every time. I have a hard time finding use for operators. That's why I'm kind of like meh, but some people really like using them. So I'm never going to discount them totally. I don't want to like skip over them, but that's about it. And it's just a matter of like minus. Yep, it's going to minus 10. Multiplication. Yep, it's going to multiply it by 10. And divide. Yes, it's going to multiply or divide by 10. Like it's what you think. But the big ticket item is understanding what the unit is on the left. So if I change it to rem, it's now going to be rems. If I change it to m's, it's now going to be m's. If I change it to VWs, you get the idea. So PX in this case is very easy to understand. Any questions on operators? It really is that straightforward. James says, hey, would add 10% add 10%? So if we came over here and we said 30%, then we added 10, let's see if it works. Yep, it does work. So any unit, including the weird units they were using, like CM. Look at that. That is a good looking serif right there. Okay. So I think we've now been exposed properly to the basics of preprocessing. I want to talk about your assignment today and show you how it integrates with yesterday's assignment. So yesterday you built a portfolio, you looked at somebody else's code. It was pretty overwhelming and I wanted it to be that way. Guys, yesterday was so realistic. I think I've had a lot of former students, they've come back into Slack and they were like, you were not kidding when you said 8,000 lines of CSS. And I'm like, I know, I tried to tell you, but they don't, you never listen because you never get out there. And then we do these funny little code pens like this. And it's like, oh, it's so nice, CSS. And then you get 8,000 lines of CSS and you're like, oh my gosh. So I'm so glad that you guys got exposed to that way early so that when you continue to work on it, you're not so scared anymore. You know what's coming. And of course, as you just continue to play around with this stuff, it's going to get easier. So don't be too hard on yourself. I saw a couple of you getting a little too hard on yourself. And I just want you to remember that the assignment was meant to some parts overwhelm you and show you why some of these smaller things are so important. Some of you are a little confused about the preprocessing with the SAS. And that's okay. It was a stretch goal. I want to talk about stretch goals for a second. I feel like some of you think that stretch goals are required, or somehow if you don't do the stretch goals, you're not as cool. Stop that. Stretch goals are beyond things that I talk about in class. So for example, the things that we talked about in class would have applied to building the portfolio, right? Reading HTML, seeing the CSS. The stretch goal was to go and try to get the preprocessor working on a new branch just to see if you could get it working. I saw a lot of you were like getting really down on yourselves and like, it was confusing and the instruction wasn't clear. And I'm like, yeah, because it's a stretch goal. Like you've got to go stretch and Google it and try to figure it out. So that's why. Like you need to understand that stretch goals are not like 3 stars are special. 2 stars is what I want you to get. 2 stars in my mind is like you get a job. 3 stars is like you're interested, you're taking it further. So I want to make sure that you understand the distinction there. Like stretch goal is like you are going on a limb and Googling and trying it out. So just wanted to point that out early on because you're going to see more stretch goals in the future that are even crazier. And I don't want you to be like, oh man, I suck, I can't get 3 stars. No way. We get 3, like you'll get 3 stars some days, and some days you'll get 2, and some days you'll get 1. Like it's just, that's how life is. So please don't beat up on yourself if you're not a 3-star every day. Okay. Let's talk about the project. So pre-processing 1, there we go. Come down here. So notice it's a digital resume. This is not the same thing as a portfolio. A portfolio is a way for you to show off your work. It's a way for people to see your GitHub repo. It's a way for you to kind of show off some of your coding chops. A resume is exactly that. It's meant for you to show your work history and to talk about, some of you I saw like in channel kind of getting confused about this yesterday, the distinction between a portfolio and a resume. So a resume is for you to showcase different skills. I also saw some of you say, man, do I really want to show that, I wasn't working in tech? Guys, those things are good. Like when I see people come into my office and they have this amazing code on GitHub, and I can see that they've literally only worked at Subway for the past 7 years, I'm like, dang, you are working hard. Like for me, that is a huge, huge thing that showcases grit and determination. And I'm actually more excited about that 7 years at Subway than if you were like interning at some crappy job that had an internet tag tied to it. So like, I appreciate hard work. I know that people that know what they're doing appreciate hard work. So make sure. Okay, so a good question comes in. What about no working experience? The cool thing is you have been doing something, right? You have been, even if you're playing video games, you've been doing something. And so you can talk about the things that you've been doing and the skills that you acquired. So I had someone on their resume say World of Warcraft Dungeon Master or GM or whatever. And I was like, that's dope. Tell me about that. So those things come through and they're like, well, I managed 30 people or 20 people in a raid instance in World of Warcraft. And I was like, that is freaking hard. So, okay, that's pretty cool. Guildmaster, there we go. So anyway, I'm saying this because it's real. Like people want to see what you're doing and the experience you have. Don't shy away from that. Okay, so in the digital resume, you have an opportunity to showcase your skills. So in this case, I want you to link your portfolio, your resume together. So in your portfolio from yesterday, you could find a way to link to your resume and showcase this. However, if you're like a little nervous, I saw some of your feedback was like, I don't have a lot of work experience and this was really hard for me to put myself out there. I read that feedback. I take it to heart. If you're one of those people that's just a little bit nervous right now about that, I get it. And you can make a fake resume for a digital character or whatever, something fictitious. But I still want you to get this assignment done. So here's what it looks like. I've got a PNG of what a resume could look like. So this is just an old layout, Johnny Appleseed web dev, just super generic here. But this is something that I want you to put together. Now, if you follow this template, you will get all of the MVP requirements done. Now, remember, if I say MVP, that means minimum viable product. So I don't know if we've talked about what MVP means. You've probably seen it quite a bit, but minimum viable product means these are the minimum requirements you need to get 2 stars. So if you just like literally copy this layout, that's fine. And I actually recommend it if you're struggling with being creative. So what I mean by copy layout is you start with nothing. So yesterday I gave you everything. You were given too much, right? You were given 8,000 lines of too much. Today I'm giving you 0 and you have to build it. So it's the opposite experience. And I think this is going to be really good for you to see how nice CS or pre-processing is to work with. So in here, you can see I've got an index.html file and it just says my resume. You got one. I gave you one H1 tag. So this H1 tag is, delete it and start building your own resume. Again, if you are super nervous, about the layout and you just don't have creative juices right now because, programming is just taking up all the other effort, I've given you that PNG and you can totally use this as a blueprint for you, okay? So just keep that in the back of your mind. I've got a less folder for you with an index.less file, and I've got a reset at the top of it for you just to get started, a little box sizing, and I put some height on the HTML and body tag if you wanted it. So I've given you this at least, but everything else, start coding on line 59 down. Okay? So that is your less file. Notice that it's inside of a less folder. So make sure you're following all the instructions I gave you. Follow those to the T on the training kit. I've wrote them out line by line, and I provided a video for Mac and PC users. Sorry, Linux, but you should know. So in this case, then we have our get ignore, DS store. Don't worry about these. These were just uploaded. I got to probably delete that. By the way, DS stores are Mac operating system stamp files, and they can be ignored. So if you're confused by that, it's okay. It's just a hidden file on Mac that gets put up on Git occasionally if you forget to ignore it. Okay, now the README. I think some of you might be skipping over the README just in, excitement. Please don't skip over it. Read every line and ask questions along the way. So here's the thing. This does have old Git flow in it. So I just want you to do our normal Git flow. Like, just keep that in the back of your mind. Just do our normal Git flow. Create the branch with your first name, last name. We're going to be doing that from here on to forever, okay? So just if you ever see Git stuff that confuses you, throw it out and think we're always on the new Git flow. This is so new. You guys are the first people, and occasionally I'll see stuff like this. I'm like, dang it. So I'll change this later, but I don't want to mess with your pull request today. All right, setting up your preprocessor. This should be part of the instructions I gave in the training kit, but if you didn't have it, you still got to follow this. And then here we go, project objectives, or MVP. I want you to review the example resume, which I just talked about with you. You're only required 1 page, okay? Anything else would be anything more than that would be stretch. And then here we go, resume content provided by you. The content can be you or a fictional character, like I said. So here's the thing. These are content rules, meaning you've got to build HTML around these content rules. What does it look like? It's up to you. Like, I want to have total creative freedom for you today. Whereas yesterday, you were in a box. Today, you're building the box. The problem is, sometimes you get freaked out by layout. So again, use that resume up here if you're freaked out by that. So content-wise, follow these. Navigation, intro, skills, a work history. I want to see all that. Now, when it comes to the pre-processing, I want to see variables using color and a font stack. Nesting. So I want to make sure that you're using nesting properly. Mix-ins, I want you to create 2 mix-ins. For example, flexbox, centering, border. You'd be done with just 2 mix-ins. I want you to show me that you know how to use them. And then mobile, I want you to use nested mobile at rules to provide a mobile version of your resume. Use 500px, and then of course, just stack everything. You don't need to go crazy with it. So 500px, don't worry about a tablet. All right, stretch goals. Use your own Google font. Google that and figure out what that looks like. Convert the Great Idea CSS into last. So this is your Great Idea page that we built. Go convert that. That'd be fun. Create a link to the portfolio page and create a page layout that would allow users to see your work. So I want you to link it into your portfolio. Okay, that's your assignment. Let's talk about any questions you have about the compiler or any questions you have about the assignment. In the thread, Sam says, after running Let's Watch compiler on Git and working for a while, if we close Git and shut down the computer, okay, this is actually really good. Let me show you some tips and tricks on how to use the compiler. So here's my terminal, right? And of course, you need to go to wherever you need to go to run your commands. So the thing is, you need to run Git, and also you need to run the compiler. So if you're on a Mac, you can hit Control-T, or Command-T, I think. I have my keyboard mapped to PC bindings, so it's confusing me. But in this case, you can have 2 windows. See these 2 windows? So this one could be your less window. This one could be your Git window, if you want to do that. Also, you could do, I think, Command-N or Command-T, and it'll open up a whole new terminal, and you can have separate terminals. So You can have both at all times. Always have your compiler in a place that's visible to you. So if it's not visible to you, you might have an error and not know about it. So make sure you do that. So those are like, that's how I would work on this project if I were you. Lloyd makes a really good comment. It says VS Code allows for split terminals also. And yes, VS Code has its own terminal integrated into it, into your computer. So you could literally do all this in VS Code today. Okay, after running Let's Watch Compiler, if we close Git and shut down the computer, come back to work, do we run Let's Watch Compiler on it again? Yes. So one of the biggest things with the compiler is if you get to a spot where your compiler is just like yelling at you and it's full of red and you're freaking out, turn it off, rerun it, and it'll be fresh and it'll help you understand the error better. There's occasion the compiler is fallible. It does have issues occasionally. So if you do run into an issue where you feel like your compiler is just screwing you over, turn it off, open up a new terminal window, and start over again with the Let's Watch compiler. It's the old IT trick. Turn it off and start it up again, but it does work. Ian says, what is a font stack? Okay, so a font stack is the order in which the browser will render a font. So let me show you what that means. Let's see over here. So, okay, these are all the ones we talked about. This is the one for today. So a font stack. So you notice how there's these default fonts, right, that came from the browser? Well, you can overwrite them, and you should overwrite them to be whatever you want. And so in my case, well, in normal CSS, like vanilla CSS, by the way, you can write vanilla CSS. Not everything has to be like hyper variable in here. But if I come into my container and I say, okay, font family, you can come in here and say, let's say I wanted to get rid of the serifs. Remember that conversation we had? So Arial is a sans serif font. So if I put a semicolon there, you can see that the font drastically changed, right? Well, if you wanted to have Arial, it does look ever so slightly then sans serif. It's ever so slightly different. So what people will do is they will do this. Developers will do this. Arial, comma, sans serif. So just in case the user does not have Arial installed on their computer, because that's how it works, by the way. The browsers look at your computer first, and they try to see, hey, does Josh have Arial installed on their computer? Well, good news is Arial is usually installed on every browser natively. So even having the sans serif backup is kind of a joke. But we do it anyway because we always want to make sure that we don't want to have serifs just in case. Sans serif, no matter what, has always been there in the browser. So if I go to Google Fonts, by the way, one of your stretch goals, and I go find like Roboto, for example, it's actually a highly used font. I can select this font. I'm cruising through this because it really is up to you to figure this out. So we come over here, put this in our HTML, go grab this, and then you can see we've got another font stack. So I can actually bring in, well, they just have Roboto in quotes. Yeah. And now you can see Roboto if we got it in there. So if one of those things is gone, like if we deleted Roboto, then Arial, see how it's ever so slightly. It's very slight, but it is different. The stack will back up the font that's not there. So this is called a font stack. So wouldn't it be nice to have this housed in a variable? So what we can do, whoa. I'll just take this and we'll add Arial. So what I'm going to do is take this little string here and I'll pop it inside of this. I'll say at font. And usually you can just say like font stack or whatever you want. And then I'll come over here and I'll say at font stack. And then I'll pass in this string or this set of values. And now I've got my font stack in a variable. So I don't have to like guess where it is. So there you go. Lloyd says, can you go back and do stretch goals to get that 3rd star? You totally can. But the 3-star rating really only applies to sprint challenges. Like we don't keep track of your daily projects as far as like getting the Lambda badge and graduation and all that. But it's awesome. It's an awesome feeling to get a 3-star rating because you know you went way above, like you stretched. Okay, if the compiler starts screaming at you in red, read the errors. Yes, Adam, he's saying that from experience, by the way. So make sure you understand that red is good. It means that you got something to learn. Like, don't freak out when you see it. Oh my gosh. Okay, everybody. I hope today was enlightening. I hope that you're feeling really excited about pre-processing and excited for the future of your CSS styles. And it's fun to build a resume. I think you're going to have a fun time building this from scratch. I know I would. It'd be fun to build something from scratch because you've been using a lot of other people's code. So now it's start from zero. All right. Have a good day, and I will see you tomorrow. We're going to keep digging even further into pre-processing. See you later.